So we're talking about Hebrews, in case anyone's forgotten. It's only been 3 weeks. But yeah, we're gonna keep trucking. Today we're gonna go through Hebrews 7, the whole thing. But it'll be an easy. It won't be line by line because it doesn't warrant that. All right. So just to remind you where we're at. We just finished, Tony did his sermon 3 weeks ago, finished up this kind of long exhortation section in the book of Hebrews. You might remember that in Hebrews he kind of goes back and forth between talking some theology and then exhorting the people that he's writing to keep faithful even though they're being persecuted, even though they're in a tight spot. And he's doing that on purpose because he's using his theology to exhort them. It's not just that he's ADD. He's using that to exhort them. And so he talks about it a little bit, and then he switches and goes back and forth. And the passage that we just finished, that's exhortation, is the longest of the ones that are exhortation. And yeah, it's the one, if you remember, where he starts out pretty hard, like, I'd like to tell you some more things, but you guys are too mature. But we're going to press in and get to it anyway. And he kind of lays out some hard things at first, but then he kind of backs off of it. And kind of I hesitate to say good cop, bad cop, but something like that. And so just to remind us, he started in Hebrews 5. I better turn this on. He started in Hebrews 5 in the first part of the chapter talking, and then he breaks off for the rest of chapter 5 and all of chapter 6 to talk about this exhortation that he has. So now he's going back to what he started saying about the superiority of Jesus' priesthood. Yeah, I knew it's what you all wanted to hear about. But that's what he started talking about at the beginning of chapter 5, and he's going to continue into that. So just to remind us a little bit, the end of that bit in chapter 5 says, it's talking about Christ, Jesus, who in the days of his flesh offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard as a result of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and being perfected, he became the source of eternal salvation to all those who obey him, being designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And you may or may not remember that there's a couple of phrases in there that are weird about Jesus, one, learning obedience, and two, being perfected. Because it's like, wait, did he not know what obedience was? And what is this? I thought he was already perfect, right? And we talked about this probably 5 weeks ago, and not at this point, that learning obedience is just his way. The Greek word under that has to do with both learning practically and conceptually, not just conceptually. We tend to think of learning as something that's just concept only. They didn't really make a distinction there. And good educators nowadays also don't make that distinction. But in our common society, sometimes we do. But good educators realize that if there's something that you're learning that you have to put into practice, then you haven't really learned it until you've put it into practice. And so Jesus had to put into practice his obedience. He was in a situation in the Garden of Gethsemane that this is referring to, where he had to walk out that obedience. It wasn't that he didn't know how to do it or didn't know what God wanted, but he had to walk that out. And so from that standpoint, he practiced it, and then he became perfect. He was perfected. That's a word in Greek that excuse me, that means to be completed, to be fulfilled. And it's often translated perfected, like when Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, be perfect, because your heavenly Father is perfect. Right? He's saying be complete, be whole. Something that is perfect is complete or whole, right? So it's not like a crazy off the wall translation, but it does kind of obscure a little bit because we import all these other ideas when we see that word. So he says, yeah, Jesus walked out this obedience, and he got to this place where he completed what he was supposed to do. And in that way, he kind of blazed the trail for us as a human. Take it on the full human frame, and he blazed the trail in obeying and being that faithful covenant partner that God was looking for. And I'll add that the narratives and the poems in the Old Testament emphasize this over and over, that we as humans need some kind of mediator, some kind of representative to go before us into God's presence. That we can't. We're trying to get back into relationship with him, but we can't fulfill that role. And so whether it was Noah offering a sacrifice when he stepped off the ark, whether it was Abraham talking to God about Sodom and Gomorrah, whether it was Moses walking up on the mountain after the golden calf and interceding, it's the poems that develop who is this mediator going to be? Who is this perfect one, this anointed one going to be? What kind of life is he going to have? What kind of things is he going to do? That portrait gets developed throughout the prophets. And all those, it's an idea that's emphasized and returned to a lot, is that we need a mediator. We need a representative. And so that, coincidentally, that is what a priest is. Somebody who represents another. This is not something that we don't live in a very religious society in the classical sense, right? Classical, I'm meaning, places where there's temples and priests all around, right? Like Buddhist, Hindu, whatever, or ancient, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, all those folks, they completely got this. We don't. But that's what's going on there. The idea is there's this deity. Not everybody can just waltz into the presence of this deity. There's only a representative or a mediator that does it kind of on our behalf. And secular religions is the enemy twisting that because he wants to be in God's place. But it is a problem for all humans that we can't just go into cavalier into God's presence without some mediator. So, before we go any further, Melchizedek gets mentioned here. And so I want to talk just a little bit about him, if you're not familiar or if you need a refresher. So, in Genesis 14, there's a story where 4 kings, it was the king of Babylon, the king of Shinar, which is where Babylon is, and 3 of his allies, they come over from where they're at into the Canaanite area, into the promised land, because there's some rebel kings there that they need to put down this rebellion. These kings were paying tribute or whatever. They were subordinate to the Babylonian king, and they decided, you know what, we don't want to do this anymore. And the Babylonian king said, okay, I'm gonna come over and put this to right and show you who's boss. And the kings that were in rebellion were the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. These are 5 cities, all in the sign of the same plain. All of them were going to get destroyed. I think Zoar got a pass because of something Lot said. But the other 4 were all destroyed when Sodom and Gomorrah were. It wasn't just those 2. All 4 of them were destroyed. It's where the Dead Sea is right now. I feel like that's not a coincidence. A lot of ash and brimstone and stuff falling from the sky maybe permanently change the landscape there. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So these kings come over and they attack the rebel kings and they defeat them and they take their possessions and they take their people as slaves and they head back to their own country. Well, the rub here is that one of those people was Lot. Lot had moved there, and that's Abraham's nephew. So Abraham hears about this, and he decides to go back and see if he can go after those guys and see if he can rescue him. And he went with a small group. It wasn't just himself. He had a couple allies. But this much smaller force went and attacked these 4 kings that had just defeated 5 other kings. And I think God was with them because they defeated them. And they took back the possessions and the people. And they brought them back. And on their way back is where this story happens. So that guy there, Kedorlaomer, is one of those kings that they defeated. And so Genesis 14, verse 17. After his return from defeating Kedorlaomer, that guy, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him is Abraham, at the valley of Shaveh, that is the valley of the king. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him, that's Abraham. So Melchizedek blessed Abraham. Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. And he, Abraham, gave him, Melchizedek, 1/10 of everything. This is the one story that Melchizedek is mentioned in, and he's mentioned in Psalm 110, verse 4, which Hebrews quotes extensively. We'll get to that in a minute. And that is the only place that Melchizedek is mentioned in the Bible, in the Old Testament. Not a lot of times, but a very mysterious figure. And in Second Temple literature, they loved to write, like the Qumran community that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, and some of these other communities, they loved to write and think and meditate and question and wonder who he was, because he just kind of shows up and then he's gone. Why did he come out? Why did Abraham just give him 1/10 with this blessing? What prompted him to do that? Who was he really? Well, we know that his name means king of righteousness. We know that Salem, or Salem, the place that he was a king of, that's from the word shalom, which means peace or wholeness. But there's not much more there. So yeah, that's what the author of Hebrews, though, sees something there. And I'll say, we don't have time to get into it now, but there is a cool little contrast, because this king Melchizedek comes out with bringing gifts, bread and wine, and they have this meal, and he blesses him, and Abraham gives him 1/10. And right after that, the king of Sodom wants to reward Abraham for recapturing his stuff. And Abraham says, no, I don't want it to be said that you made me rich. So there's this contrast between Melchizedek and the king of Sodom, both offering Abraham something, but one Abraham discerns is a free gift, but another comes with some strings attached. And so he accepts the one, rejects the other. He accepts the bread and wine from Melchizedek and gives 1/10 to him, but he spurns the king of Sodom. But that's all the time we have to go into on that. But it does beg the question, how many times have we seemed to receive something and we got to discern, have an opportunity to receive something and we got to discern, is this from God or not? But anyway, I'll leave that for you to meditate on some other day. All right, Hebrews 7. In Hebrews 7, the preacher returns to his discussion of the priesthood, and he talks extensively about Jesus' superior priesthood, we're gonna maybe breeze might be the word, but we're gonna just go through this whole chapter, 28 verses, but we're only gonna touch down in a few spots. All right. So Hebrews 7, first 3 verses. This Melchizedek, the king of Salem, priest of God Most High, yes, he has read Genesis, the author of Hebrews. He met with Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom Abraham also apportioned a tenth of everything. In the first place, his name, Melchizedek, means king of righteousness. And then also he was king of Salem, which means king of peace. Without father, he's speaking here of Melchizedek, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days or end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest for all time. That is a line in verse 3 there that has caused a lot of, like, who is, and I remember thinking, oh, he definitely is like some kind of type of Christ. Type is a technical word meaning he's like an example that points to the real thing, maybe, is a way to say it. But I remember thinking, at least at some point in my life, I wonder if this was actually Jesus, like in a pre-incarnate, showing up here. Because it says in Hebrews that he has no father or mother, no end of life. It's not as exotic as that. What's happening is that, and this goes back to some of the context prior in verse 5 that I didn't read all of, chapter 5, and then also what he's going to continue talking about in chapter 7. He's reading, the author of Hebrews is reading Psalm 110 verse 4, where God says to somebody, to this messianic figure, he says, I have sworn and will not change my mind. Or no, this is the psalmist writing in third person. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. And then the quote, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And so he sees a priest forever, and then he goes back and looks at Genesis 14 and goes, how many of you know that there's a number of genealogies in the Old Testament? It seems like every time you turn around sometimes, here we go, and again, another genealogy. And then the New Testament, the authors of the gospel, they have that same, they mimic that. They start out with a genealogy, all except John. But that was important. That has its reasons. But he notices here that, hey, this Melchizedek guy, he just shows up. The narrative, the story, makes no mention of where he's from and what happened to him after. He, in the story, has no father or mother, eternal. It seems like he has no end of days. It's not mentioned when he dies, what happens to him. So he's not saying that Melchizedek was all those, didn't have a father or mother. He's saying in the story, these things aren't mentioned. And he reads that in light of Psalm 110, verse 4, and he goes, yeah, here's it saying that he's a priest forever, according to Melchizedek. And sure enough, there's no genealogy mentioned about him. I think those two are connected. That's what he's doing. Does that make sense? Okay, I see a couple nods. You better nod, or else I'm going to repeat it again differently, because I'll have to try harder. So if you don't want me to keep going. But if you don't, if I'm not making sense, I'm cool with saying it again. All right. Let's keep going. Verse 4. See how great this man was, that's Melchizedek, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth from the spoils. And indeed, those of the sons of Levi who receive the priesthood have a commandment to collect a tenth from the people according to the law, that is, from their brothers, although they are descended from Abraham. So that's in the Old Testament law. The tribe of the Levites were designated as servants in the temple or in the tabernacle, and the priests were kind of of the line of Aaron, and part of the law was to collect tithes. And so he's saying, yeah, but they collect tithes from other descendants of Abraham. However, here is one who did not, verse 6, the one who did not trace his descent from them collected tithes from Abraham. So here's somebody, Melchizedek, who's not a Levite, but he's still collecting tithes. And he blessed the one who had the promises. Now, without any dispute, the inferior is blessed by the more prominent. And in this case, mortal men receive tithes. That's the Levite case. But in the Melchizedek case, it is testified that he lives. And so to speak, even Levi, the one who receives the tithes, has paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So he's saying, Levi has DNA from Abraham, is how we would say it in modern terms. And so, in a way, Levi, who collects the tithes, gave tithes to Melchizedek. That's how he's seeing it. He's making like a correlation there. And the only other thing I'll say here is that when he says, without any dispute, the inferior is blessed by the more prominent, is what my translation says. That's not a rule of thumb. Hey, only superiors can bless somebody. He's not arguing that that's how it is. He's just proclaiming that Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. He's not making an argument based on the fact that he blessed him. How do I know? Well, we read it in Genesis 4. Melchizedek blessed God. Okay, so the author of Hebrews is not saying that blessings can only go this way. He's just making a case that Melchizedek was greater. You guys still with me? All right. He goes on. He says, so, if perfection, there's that word again, completion, right, was through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it, the people received the law. He's talking about the law at Sinai, the Mosaic covenant. What further need is there for another priest to arise according to the order of Melchizedek, and not said to be according to the order of Aaron? He's saying, if God could have accomplished his purposes, the fulfillment, the perfection that he wanted through the Levitical priesthood, then why did we need another one from a different line? That's the question he's asking. He says, because, verse 12, when the priesthood changes, there's got to be a change in the law too, right? Because the law said only the Levites can be priests. So for there to be a priest from some other place, there had to be a change in the law. And he mentions that, verse 14, we all know that Jesus was descended from Judah, right? So he's not a Levite. Then verse 15, he says, another thing about this changing of the priesthood that makes it really clear is if another priest arises according to the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest not according to a law of physical requirement. So he's not a priest because he was a Levite, but according to the power of an indestructible life. And here's, I think, the second, maybe the third time that he's quoted. That's the tail end of Psalm 110, verse 4. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, that's the Levitical, a preceding commandment is set aside because of weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. He's saying it's ineffective. The law was ineffective for making perfect. But on the other hand, Melchizedek, there is the introduction of a better hope through which we draw near to God. Remember that, a better hope. We're almost there. He goes on. He says, and by as much as this was not without an oath. And so he starts talking about, hey, in that Psalm 110, verse 4, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And he's already touched on this before in Hebrews, and he in chapter 5, but he comes back to this and he says, Jesus became a priest of this order through an oath. And that's a big deal. That someone as powerful as God made a promise. And he said that he wasn't going to change his mind. It's kind of like he's doubling down. And he says, because of this greater, let's say, he didn't, this priest was instituted through something stronger, through this oath. And because that's stronger, he says, just in that way, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. So a guarantee, this word could be translated guarantor as well, so that either the thing or the person. But a guarantee is a formal pledge that some condition is going to be met or upheld, right? If it's a guarantee on your car, then we'll fix it if something breaks, right? If it's a guarantee on a loan, I'll pay the loan. If you stop paying it, I'll be responsible for finish paying it because I'm the guarantor. And so he's saying Jesus is that. He's the one that guarantees a better covenant. Remember, a covenant is a partnership. And so he's saying that the new covenant that Jesus announced, remember at the last night at the Lord's Supper, he said, this is the blood, this is my blood of a new covenant. And that is the new covenant he's referring to here, the better covenant. And the old one is the Mosaic covenant at Sinai, right? And he's saying, there's a better covenant. And I think we all know why it's better, but and they knew why it's better, but he talks some more about it, so we'll get into that. And he goes on to point out that many have become priests, is verse 23. There were lots of priests because they died. They couldn't be priests forever. They died. A new guy had to take his place. But he, Jesus, continues forever. So he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, because of this permanent priesthood, he's able to save completely those who draw near to God through him. Because he always lives in order to intercede on their behalf. This completely word is related to that perfected word. It has a prefix in front of it. And I mention this because I just think it's cool because he's doubling down on it. So the Greek word for complete or perfected is teleos, and that's what it means. Fulfilled, complete, perfected. This word here, save completely, I like the ESV says to the uttermost, but most translations say something like completely. That's panteleos. Pan means all. So it's all complete. So like he's doubling down. Because if something is complete, then to saying it's completely complete is kind of like doubling down. It's all complete. There's not some little bit that's not left complete. And so Jesus, because he has this permanent priesthood, he's able to rescue us very completely. And he always lives to intercede. I'm not going to lose my intercessor to death and have to start over with a new one. To get to know him, to get him to, be on my side, in my corner, and intercede for me, right? I'm not going to lose that because he's going to be a priest forever. And then here he wraps it up, last 3 verses, kind of concluding everything he's saying. A high priest such as this is indeed what we needed. Holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and having become exalted above the skies. does not need every day, like the Levitical high priest, to offer sacrifices for his own sins and then for the sins of the people, because he did this once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints men as high priests who have weaknesses, but the statement of the oath after the law appoints a son who is made perfect or complete forever. Jesus is the mediator we needed, the representative we were looking for, the representative that the Old Testament is pointing towards, the representative that the Old Testament is sketching this portrait of and filling it out and refining it. This is the one we needed. Somebody who could be the perfect covenant partner and represent all the rest of us. The Old Testament priests, they weren't perfect, so whenever they went to offer a sacrifice, Day of Atonement for the sins of the people, first thing he had to do was offer a sacrifice for himself. And then once he was pure, he could offer a sacrifice for somebody else. And Hebrews is saying, yeah, but Jesus doesn't need to do that because he was already perfect, holy, innocent, undefiled. But what about the other bit, offering the sacrifice for us? Well, he doesn't need to do that over and over either because he offered a better sacrifice himself. And we're going to talk about more about that in the coming chapters of Hebrews. But that's an astounding sentence right there. Because he did this once for all when he offered up himself. As high priest, he officiated at his own sacrifice. That's pretty hard to do. All right. So what? There's this mediator, there's this priest, there's this old way of doing it, there's this better way of doing it. So what? How does this apply? I want to start out by just pointing out something that you might not think is true, but it is. Theology is practical. If you have a piece of theology that you think has no practical value, then it just means you haven't figured out how it applies yet. And that's okay, but know that it does apply. It's not just learning from a book, learning a concept. Everything that's written in God's Word was written for our instruction. There's not a wasted word, a wasted story, a wasted poem. And these chapters in Hebrews are not here to merely explain the theology behind our conversion experience. Oh, you needed this priest, and so you could believe in him and be saved and be baptized. And that's what happened. You didn't know it when that was happening, but that's what happened. Now you know. This is not what he's doing, just trying to explain the technicalities behind your conversion experience. So, when I read the Gospels in my Bible, I observe that when Jesus was under great stress, I've noticed what comes out of him when he's under great stress. I'm thinking of, for example, when he goes into the wilderness and he hasn't eaten for 40 days and he gets tested. If you don't think that's a stressful situation, go ahead and try it. Not eating for 40 days by yourself the whole time in a desolate area with no other contact, and see what you start seeing in the shadows. And let's say that you had the power to feed yourself, and all you had to do was make it happen. And someone suggested that to you. Would that be an enticing idea after 40 days? But what came out of Jesus when he was in these great stress moments? When he knew what he was here to do and he was offered a shortcut? The word. He started quoting from Deuteronomy. What came out of Jesus when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane? Even there, he said things like, my soul is anguished to the point of death, kind of an allusion to Isaiah 53, verse 12. When he's on the cross, the most anguished point in his life, what does he do? He quotes Psalm 22, verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? Even in his anguish, that's what came out of him. And I've observed that what comes out of you when you're in a moment of stress is the things that are deepest inside. What's higher up, what's more superficial, just goes out the window. This is the principle behind like training soldiers. When you're in a stressful situation, you're not thinking anymore, you're doing something that's a little deeper inside you. But this is what came out of Jesus. The things that he had meditated on, that he had steeped his soul and his spirit on and his mind over his life since he was a boy. That's what came out of him when he was in a moment of stress. It wasn't just theology impractical for him. My mother, 12 and a half years ago, on a Friday morning, going about her day, and suddenly woke up feeling, I think it was close to when she woke up, but started feeling a pain, a sharp pain in this area. And 3 to 4 hours later, she couldn't walk. Best health in her life before that. And not just couldn't walk, but like from here down. So no core, or those core muscles, all that. That's a stressful situation. In 4 hours, you wake up one day. Imagine you woke up tomorrow, and the next thing you know, you can't walk. 4 hours by midday. And I remember talking to her through those initial, we talked a lot, but in those initial days, and one of the first messages I had from her, I heard from my dad, but one of the first messages I had from her directly started off by saying, we're in the midst of a great battle. That's what came out of her in a moment of stress. How she framed her situation wasn't, oh, poor me. It was, this is a fight. There's something against us, and we have to fight back. And she showed me a picture in her hospital room. She had just written out on 8.5 by 10 sheets of paper, Bible verses posted along the walls and stuff all over the room. Some she'd put there, some people brought to her. Sometimes somebody would drop by and encourage her with a verse, and she'd say, hey, before you go, write it down on a piece of paper, post it up there. That's what she wanted to keep. So it came out of her, and what she wanted to keep on her mind during that time. If it's not deep in your being, you won't find it when you're in that moment of stress. And sometimes when someone offers you, you're in a moment of difficulty, and somebody tries to encourage you with something from the Bible, a verse, an idea. So I know there's bad ways to do that, all right? But I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about doing it well. There's a difference between it feeling like an empty platitude to you They're just saying empty words that don't mean anything to me, quoting some verse at me. The difference between that feeling like an empty platitude versus something that sustains your soul is whether or not some of that was already in there. And what that verse is just doing is just calling it up versus it was never there to begin with. So theology is practical, and we've just talked about a lot of theological things. When you're in a moment of testing, of suffering or anguish, that's not the best time to start learning those things. The best time is before, so that they're ready. You have them at hand when you're in that situation. Not saying you can't, and I'm not saying that God doesn't deepen things or add nuances to things during these stressful situations. But I am saying that's not the time to start. That's not the best time to start. If it's the only time, then definitely start. But it's not the best time to start. We need to have it inside before. So what comes out of you in your moments of life stress? When the wind and the rain and the storm buffet the house of your life. As Jesus talked about in the Sermon on the Mount, what happens? What kind of foundation are you on? Well, I don't know about you, but I can tell you a few things that have a great help in that situation. There's someone who lived among us as a human. He was tempted like us, and he suffered like us. He knows what we're going through. But he was raised up to the heavens. So he has direct access to God. Nothing in between. And knows what I'm going through, and he can make intercession for me. And you know what? He's immortal. He's not given up this position. He's not going anywhere. His guarantee is eternal. He has all authority. He's a king, not just a priest. So when he intercedes on my behalf, what he asks for, he gets. Because he has that authority. He's defeated death and the grave. He holds the key to life. And he is my representative, my advocate, my intercessor. That is what Hebrews 7 is saying. And it's not impractical. That's the thing that sustains you in the small difficulties and in the great difficulties. In sudden illness, in a turn of fortunes, false accusations. That is what sustains you. That's what we need to get inside of us. That is what the Bible is inviting us to meditate on. Psalm 1. The best kind of reader of the Bible is someone who meditates on it day and night. The ideal reader is one who meditates on the word day and night. Becomes like a tree planted by streams of water, whose his leaf does not wither. And when we meditate, that's how this gets deep inside us. All right? So I want to charge you with that. Whatever you're doing, take it up a notch. If you're at 0, take it up to 1. If you're at 10, take it to 11. Yes, it goes to 11. If you're at 11, take it to 12. past 12? I don't know. There are 12 disciples, but no, I digress. Whatever you're doing, take it up a notch. That's my charge. To get these things inside you. They're an anchor for the soul. They're life. They're life. They're not just words.